The young archaeologist stared at the ancient text on her computer screen. The words seemed to dance before her tired eyes as she read about a magnificent civilization that had vanished. Beneath the waves over 9,000 years ago, Atlantis. Even the name carried magic and mystery. She was not alone in her fascination. Millions of people around the world shared her obsession with this lost world that may never have existed at all. In movie theaters across the globe, audiences watched heroes dive into crystal blue waters searching for the sunken city. Bookshops displayed dozens of titles promising to reveal the true location of Atlantis. Television documentaries explored every corner of the earth looking for evidence of this ancient civilization. From the Mediterranean Sea to the Caribbean, from Antarctica to the Sahara Desert, explorers claimed to have found traces of the lost continent. But here was the remarkable truth that most people did not know. The entire story of Atlantis came from just one source. A single ancient Greek philosopher named Plato wrote about this civilization in two of his works over 2,000 years ago. No other ancient writer before Plato had ever mentioned Atlantis. No Egyptian records spoke of it. No Babylonian tablets described it. The tale began and nearly ended with Plato himself. This created a puzzle that has challenged scholars for centuries. Did Plato describe a real place that actually existed? Or did he create an elaborate fiction to teach important lessons about politics, power, and human nature? The question matters more than most people realize. It touches on fundamental issues that still affect us today. How do we separate truth from fiction? How do we interpret ancient texts? What can stories teach us even when they might not be literally true? The mystery begins with timing. Plato lived in Athens during the 4th century before Christ. His city had just lost a devastating war with Sparta. Democracy was struggling. Political corruption was everywhere. The greatest teacher Plato had ever known, a man named Socrates, had been executed by the Athenian government for asking too many uncomfortable questions. The world Plato knew was falling apart around him. Into this troubled time, Plato introduced the story of Atlantis. He described a powerful island nation that had once ruled much of the ancient world. According to his account, Atlantis had been blessed by the gods with incredible wealth and military might. The Atlanteans had built magnificent cities with golden walls and silver towers. They had tamed wild horses and sailed across vast oceans in mighty ships. Their technology was far ahead of other civilizations. But success had corrupted the Atlanteans. They became proud and greedy. They started wars to conquer other lands. They forgot the wisdom that had made them great. So the gods punished them. In a single day and night, earthquakes and floods destroyed their entire civilization. The island sank beneath the waves, leaving no trace except memories preserved in the temples of ancient Egypt. Plato told this story through the voice of a character named Critias, who claimed to have heard it from his grandfather, who had learned it from the famous Athenian lawgiver Solon, who had traveled to Egypt and spoken with priests there. The priests, Critias explained, had ancient records that went back thousands of years. They had told Solon about the Great War between Atlantis and prehistoric Athens, a war that Athens had won just before the destruction of Atlantis. The details Plato provided were incredibly specific. He described the exact size of the island, the layout of its capital city, the number of ships in its navy, even the types of animals that lived there. He wrote about the island's 3 circular harbors, its hot and cold springs, its mountains rich with precious metals, and its vast plains perfect for agriculture. He explained how the Atlanteans organized their government, conducted their religious ceremonies, and trained their warriors. Such precise details made the story seem authentic. Many readers throughout history have been convinced that Plato must have been reporting real historical facts. After all, why would anyone invent such elaborate specifics if they were just making up a story? The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who had been Plato's student, famously disagreed. He believed his teacher had created Atlantis as a fictional example to illustrate philosophical points about ideal societies and their eventual corruption. This disagreement between Plato and Aristotle set the stage for a debate that continues today. Modern scholars remain divided. Some argue that Plato based his story on dim memories of real historical events. Perhaps he had heard tales of the volcanic eruption that destroyed the island of Thera around 1500 before Christ. Maybe he knew about the sudden collapse of the Minoan civilization on Crete. Others suggest he was inspired by the Persian Wars. when the mighty Persian Empire had threatened to conquer all of Greece. The alternative view holds that Atlantis was pure invention, a philosophical thought experiment designed to explore important questions about politics and morality. In this interpretation, Plato used the story to warn his readers about the dangers of unchecked power and material excess. The rise and fall of Atlantis served as a mirror for Athens itself, showing how even the greatest civilizations could destroy themselves through pride and corruption. The question of whether Atlantis was real or fictional connects to larger issues that remain relevant today. In our modern world, we are constantly bombarded with information from countless sources. Social media spreads both facts and rumors at lightning speed. News organizations compete to break stories first, sometimes before they can verify all the details. Conspiracy theories flourish alongside legitimate research. The challenge of distinguishing truth from fiction has never been more important. Plato's method of presenting his ideas through stories and dialogues offers valuable lessons for our information age. He understood that people learn better through engaging narratives than through dry lectures. He knew that a compelling story could make complex philosophical ideas accessible to ordinary readers. Whether Atlantis was real or imagined, it has succeeded brilliantly in capturing human imagination and provoking serious thought about the nature of civilization itself. The enduring popularity of Atlantis reveals something important about human nature. We are drawn to stories of lost golden ages and fallen civilizations. We want to believe that somewhere in the past, people created something perfect that was then tragically destroyed. These stories speak to our hopes and fears about our own society. They remind us that no civilization lasts forever, but they also inspire us to strive for something better. As we embark on this journey through Plato's world and mind, we will explore all these questions and more. We will examine the historical context that shaped his thinking, investigate his biography and philosophy, and trace the influence of his ideas through the centuries. Most importantly, we will grapple with the central mystery that continues to fascinate us today. Was Atlantis a real place lost to time? Or was it something far more valuable? A timeless mirror reflecting the hopes and failings of human civilization itself. The morning sun casts long shadows across the marble steps of the Parthenon as citizens gathered in the agora below. It was the 5th century before Christ, and Athens was the most powerful city in the Greek world. Ships from across the Mediterranean brought exotic goods to her busy harbors. Philosophers debated in the shade of olive trees. Artists carved statues that would inspire people for thousands of years. This was the Athens that would shape the mind of a young aristocrat named Plato. But even in this golden age, trouble was brewing. The very success that made Athens great was also creating the seeds of her destruction. The story of how this magnificent civilization rose and fell would deeply influence Plato's thinking about power, politics, and the fate of nations. Understanding this world is essential to understanding why he might have created the story of Atlantis. Athens had not always been the center of Greek civilization. For centuries, she had been just another small city-state among many scattered across the Greek peninsula and islands. Her transformation began in the early 5th century when the mighty Persian Empire decided to conquer Greece. The Persians had already swallowed up the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Now they turned their attention to the mainland. The Persian invasion changed everything. When the Persian fleet landed at Marathon in 490 before Christ, Athens stood almost alone against the mightiest empire in the world. Against all odds, the Athenian army won a stunning victory. 10 years later, when an even larger Persian force invaded Greece, Athens again played a crucial role in the Greek victory. The Athenian navy destroyed the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis, saving all of Greece from conquest. These victories transformed Athens from a regional power into the leader of the Greek world. Other cities joined the Delian League, an alliance led by Athens supposedly created to defend against future Persian attacks. But what began as a defensive alliance gradually became an Athenian empire. Athens demanded tribute from her allies and used this wealth to fund massive building projects and maintain a powerful navy. The man who oversaw this transformation was Pericles, one of the greatest statesmen in human history. Under his leadership, Athens reached heights of cultural achievement that have never been surpassed. He commissioned the construction of the Parthenon and other magnificent buildings that still crown the Acropolis today. He supported the work of sculptors like Phidias and dramatists like Sophocles and Euripides. He promoted the development of democracy, giving ordinary citizens a voice in government that they had never enjoyed before. Pericles understood that Athens was creating something new in the world. In a famous speech honoring soldiers who had died in war, he described Athens as the school of Greece, a city that showed other Greeks what human beings could achieve when they were free to pursue excellence. Athenian democracy was not perfect by modern standards. Women could not vote, slaves had no rights, and foreigners were excluded from citizenship. But for free male citizens, Athens offered opportunities for political participation that were revolutionary for their time. The cultural achievements of this period were extraordinary. In the theaters of Athens, playwrights invented tragedy and comedy as dramatic forms. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote plays that are still performed today. Their works explored deep questions about justice, fate, and human nature. At the same time, historians like Herodotus and Thucydides were creating new ways of understanding and recording the past. Philosophers like Anaxagoras and later Socrates were developing new methods of thinking about the natural world and human behavior. Athens also became a center of learning that attracted brilliant minds from across the Greek world. The city welcomed foreign teachers called sophists, who offered instruction in rhetoric, philosophy, and other subjects. Young men from wealthy families flocked to Athens to receive the best education available. The city buzzed with intellectual energy and debate. It seemed as if human knowledge and achievement had no limits. But this golden age carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The wealth and power that made Athens great also made her enemies. Other Greek cities grew jealous and fearful of Athenian dominance. Sparta, Athens' old rival, began to organize opposition to Athenian power. The Spartans had a very different vision of what Greek civilization should look like, where Athens celebrated individual achievement and democratic participation. Sparta emphasized discipline, tradition, and military strength. The conflict between these two visions of Greek life erupted in 431 before Christ, when the Peloponnesian War began. This was not just a war between two cities, but a struggle for the soul of Greek civilization. Athens represented innovation, democracy, and cultural achievement. Sparta represented stability, tradition, and military virtue. The war would last for 27 years and ultimately destroy both sides. The early years of the war saw Athens using her naval superiority to strike at Spartan territory while avoiding major land battles. Pericles' strategy was to let the Spartans ravage the Athenian countryside, while keeping the population safe behind the city's walls. The Athenian navy would maintain control of the seas and keep supplies flowing into the city. It was a sensible plan, but it required enormous discipline and sacrifice from the Athenian people. The strategy began to crumble when plague struck Athens in 430 before Christ. The disease, possibly typhoid fever, spread rapidly through the overcrowded city. Thousands died, including Pericles himself. The loss of their greatest leader at such a crucial moment was devastating for Athenian morale. New leaders emerged, but they lacked Pericles' wisdom and restraint. They began to pursue more aggressive policies that would ultimately prove disastrous. The war dragged on year after year, consuming the wealth that Athens had accumulated during her golden age. Both sides committed terrible atrocities. Athens destroyed entire cities and enslaved their populations. Sparta accepted Persian gold to build a fleet that could challenge Athenian naval supremacy. The noble ideals that had inspired Greek civilization were gradually forgotten in the brutal struggle for survival. The end came in 404 before Christ when the Athenian fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Aegispotami. With her navy gone, Athens could no longer maintain her empire or even feed her own population. The city surrendered to Sparta, and the Golden Age was over. The victorious Spartans tore down the walls that had protected Athens and installed a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. This traumatic experience shaped the thinking of everyone who lived through it, including the young Plato. He had been born around 428 before Christ, just as the war was beginning. He grew up watching his city's gradual decline from the heights of power and culture to defeat and humiliation. The democracy that Pericles had praised as the school of Greece had ended up destroying itself through pride, greed, and poor judgment. Even more troubling was what happened after the war. The 30 tyrants, supported by Sparta, proved to be corrupt and murderous. They killed or exiled thousands of Athenians and seized their property. When democracy was finally restored in 403 before Christ, it seemed weak and uncertain. The confident optimism of the Golden Age had been replaced by doubt and fear. This was the world that shaped Plato's understanding of politics and human nature. He had seen how even the greatest civilization could destroy itself through the very qualities that had made it great. The story of Atlantis, with its themes of rise and fall, corruption and divine punishment, would reflect these painful lessons learned from watching Athens' own tragic history. The young aristocrat walked through the ruins of what had once been the greatest city in the world. Athens in 404 before Christ was a shadow of her former glory. The great walls that had protected the city lay in rubble. The mighty fleet that had ruled the Mediterranean was gone. The democracy that had inspired other cities had been replaced by a brutal oligarchy. For 20-year-old Plato, this devastation was not just political tragedy, but personal awakening. Plato had been born into one of Athens' most distinguished families around 428 before Christ. His real name was Aristocles, but everyone called him Plato, which probably meant broad, referring either to his wide shoulders or his broad forehead. His family traced their ancestry back to the ancient kings of Athens and the legendary lawgiver Solon. On his mother's side, he was related to Cretes, who would later become one of the notorious 30 tyrants. This aristocratic background gave Plato advantages that most Athenians could never dream of, but it also burdened him with expectations and responsibilities. As a young man, Plato seemed destined for a career in politics. His family connections and education prepared him for leadership in Athenian society. He studied gymnastics, music, and mathematics, as all well-born Greeks did. He probably served in the military during the final years of the Peloponnesian War, though no records of his service survive. Everything about his background suggested he would follow the traditional path of aristocratic young men and seek power and influence in the assembly and courts of Athens. But Plato's life took a different direction when he encountered a remarkable man named Socrates. This encounter would change not only Plato's destiny, but the entire course of Western philosophy. Socrates was unlike any teacher Athens had ever seen. He was not a professional educator like the sophists who charged fees for their instruction. He claimed to know nothing himself and spent his time asking questions that revealed how little other people knew as well. Socrates had a unique method of teaching. Instead of lecturing, he engaged people in conversations that exposed the weaknesses in their thinking. He would ask simple questions about concepts like justice, courage, or beauty. As people tried to answer, he would ask more questions that revealed contradictions and assumptions they had never examined. Through this process, which came to be called the Socratic method, he showed that most people held beliefs they could not properly defend. The older man's influence on young Plato was profound. Socrates taught him that the unexamined life was not worth living, showed him that true wisdom began with recognizing one's own ignorance. He demonstrated that moral and political questions required the same careful thinking that mathematicians applied to geometry. Most importantly, he convinced Plato that the pursuit of truth and virtue was more important than wealth, power, or social status. Under Socrates' guidance, Plato began to see the world differently. The political career that his family expected no longer seemed attractive. The democracy that many Athenians praised appeared flawed and dangerous. The sophists who claimed to teach wisdom seemed to be selling clever tricks rather than genuine knowledge. Plato became part of a small circle of young men who gathered around Socrates, eager to learn from his unique approach to understanding the world. This philosophical apprenticeship continued for about 8 years, from roughly 407 to 399 before Christ. During this period, Plato watched Socrates challenge the assumptions of politicians, poets, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens. He saw how the philosopher's questions made people uncomfortable and sometimes angry. He also witnessed Socrates' remarkable courage, both in military service and in standing up to political pressure. The apprenticeship ended abruptly and tragically in 399 before Christ, when Socrates was put on trial by the restored Athenian democracy. The charges were corruption of the youth and impiety toward the gods. The real reason was probably that many powerful Athenians resented Socrates' constant questioning and his association with some of the men who had supported the 30 tyrants. Plato's own relative Critias had been one of the most brutal of these tyrants, which may have made Socrates seem guilty by association. The trial was a mockery of justice. Socrates defended himself brilliantly, but the jury of 500 citizens voted to condemn him to death. Even then, he might have escaped by proposing exile as an alternative punishment. Instead, he suggested that the city should reward him with free meals for life, as they did for Olympic victors. This display of principle and humor in the face of death only angered the jury more. They voted for the death penalty by an even larger margin. For 30 days, Socrates sat in prison while his friends tried to arrange his escape. Plato was probably among those who offered to help him flee Athens. But Socrates refused to break the law, even a law that condemned him unjustly. He spent his final days discussing philosophy with his followers. On the last day, he drank the cup of hemlock poison and died, surrounded by friends who wept for the loss of the wisest and most just man they had ever known. The execution of Socrates was a turning point in Plato's life. The democracy that claimed to represent the will of the people had murdered the best man in Athens. This confirmed Plato's growing belief that popular government was dangerous and unstable. It also convinced him that he could never participate in Athenian politics. How could he serve a system that had killed his beloved teacher? After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens and began a period of travel that would last nearly 12 years. He went first to nearby Megara, where he studied with Euclides, a philosopher who had been influenced by both Socrates and earlier thinkers like Parmenides. This exposure to different philosophical traditions helped Plato develop his own unique approach to the questions that Socrates had raised. From Megara, Plato traveled to Egypt, where he studied with priests who claimed to possess ancient wisdom. Egypt had always fascinated the Greeks because of its great antiquity and mysterious traditions. The priests told stories of events that had happened thousands of years before Greek civilization began. They spoke of natural disasters that had destroyed entire civilizations, and of wisdom that had been lost and recovered many times throughout history. These ideas would later appear in Plato's account of Atlantis. Plato also journeyed to southern Italy, where he encountered the followers of Pythagoras. These philosophers combined mathematical thinking with religious beliefs. They taught that numbers and geometric relationships were the key to understanding the universe. They also believed in the immortality of the soul and the possibility of achieving wisdom through disciplined study and moral purification. These Pythagorean ideas would strongly influence Plato's later philosophy. Perhaps most importantly, Plato traveled to Sicily, where he became involved in the turbulent politics of Syracuse. The ruler of Syracuse, Dionysius the Elder, was a tyrant who had made his city the most powerful in the Greek West. Plato was invited to Syracuse by Dion, the tyrant's brother-in-law, who hoped that Plato could help create a more just government. His first visit to Sicily ended badly when Plato criticized the tyrant's lifestyle and was apparently sold into slavery, though he was quickly ransomed by friends. Despite this setback, Plato's travels had given him a broader perspective on human nature and political possibilities. He had seen different forms of government and different approaches to philosophy. He had studied with teachers who preserved ancient traditions and others who were developing new ideas. Most importantly, he had begun to formulate his own vision of what philosophy should be and how it could serve human society. When Plato finally returned to Athens around 387 before Christ, he was no longer the young aristocrat who had left after Socrates' death. He was now a mature philosopher with his own ideas about truth, justice, and the good life. He had learned from the greatest teacher of his generation and had explored the wisdom of other cultures. He was ready to begin the work that would make him one of the most influential thinkers in human history. The man who would create the story of Atlantis had been shaped by personal tragedy, political upheaval, and years of study with the greatest minds of his time. His unique combination of aristocratic background, philosophical training, and cosmopolitan experience would enable him to create works that spoke to the deepest questions of human existence. The journey from privileged youth to philosophical master was complete. How the real work could begin. The elderly philosopher sat in his study surrounded by scrolls and tablets covered with his careful handwriting. It was around 360 before Christ, and Plato had been working on his masterpiece for years. The Republic, his great work on justice and the ideal state, was nearly complete. But something was missing. He had described the perfect society in theory, but he wanted to show what might happen to such a society in practice. He needed a story that would bring his abstract ideas to life. The inspiration came from memories of his travels to Egypt decades earlier. The priests there had told him fascinating stories about ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen long before Greek history began. They spoke of a great war between an island empire and prehistoric Athens, a conflict that had taken place 9,000 years before his own time. The island empire had been incredibly powerful and wealthy, but it had been destroyed in a single day by earthquakes and floods. The priests called this lost civilization Atlantis. Plato began to weave this ancient tale into his philosophical works. He would tell the story through the voices of characters in his dialogues, just as he had done with the teachings of Socrates. The story would serve multiple purposes. It would show how even the most perfect society could be corrupted by power and wealth. It would demonstrate the consequences of abandoning wisdom and virtue. And it would provide a thrilling narrative that would capture readers' attention, while teaching them important lessons about politics and morality. The story of Atlantis appears in two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Unfinished Critias. These works were written late in Plato's life, when he had fully developed his philosophical system and was looking for new ways to present his ideas. The dialogues are set in Athens shortly after the festival of Athena, and they feature four main characters engaged in philosophical discussion. The conversation begins when Socrates expresses a desire to see the ideal state that he had described in the Republic actually in action. He wants to hear about real events, not just theoretical possibilities. This gives one of the characters, Critias, the opportunity to tell the remarkable story that his great-grandfather had learned from the famous Athenian lawgiver, Solon. According to Critias, Solon had traveled to Egypt in his old age and had visited the temple of Neith in the city of Sais. There he met with priests who possessed ancient records going back thousands of years. These priests told Solon that the Greeks were like children who knew nothing of their own early history. They revealed that Athens had once been the greatest city in the world, far greater than it was in Solon's time, or even in the golden age of Pericles. The priests explained that 9,000 years before Solon's visit, Athens had been threatened by a mighty empire from the west. This empire controlled a great island, larger than Libya and Asia combined. The island was called Atlantis, and it was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. From this island, the Atlanteans had conquered much of Europe and Africa. Only Athens had been able to resist their advance. Plato's description of Atlantis through the voice of Critias is remarkably detailed. The island was roughly circular, about 50 miles across, with a large central plain surrounded by mountains. The capital city was built on a small island in the center, connected to the mainland by bridges and canals. The city consisted of alternating rings of land and water, with the palace and main temple at the very center. The Atlanteans were descendants of the sea god Poseidon, who had divided the island among his 10 sons. The eldest son, Atlas, became the first king and gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. Each of the 10 kingdoms had its own ruler, but they were all bound together by laws that Poseidon had inscribed on a pillar of precious metal in the central temple. The island was incredibly wealthy. The mountains contained gold, silver, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum that was more valuable than anything except gold itself. The forests provided timber for shipbuilding. The plains produced abundant crops. The seas teemed with fish. Hot and cold springs provided water throughout the city. The Atlanteans had tamed horses and elephants and had built harbors large enough for the biggest ships. Their technology was far advanced. They had created artificial harbors carved from solid rock. They had built walls covered with brass, tin, and orichalcum that gleamed like fire. They had constructed a vast canal system that brought water from the mountains to every part of the island. Their navy consisted of 1,200 ships, and they could field an army of over 1 million men. But the most remarkable thing about Atlantis was its government. The 10 kings met every 5th and 6th year alternately to discuss common affairs and judge any disputes between the kingdoms. Before making important decisions, they would hunt a sacred bull in the temple of Poseidon, using only clubs and nooses. The captured bull would be sacrificed, and its blood would be mixed with wine for the kings to drink as they swore to uphold the laws. For many generations, the Atlanteans lived according to these divine laws. They were noble and generous, caring more for virtue than for wealth. They were skilled in war, but preferred peace. They were wise rulers who governed justly and treated their subjects fairly. As long as they maintained these qualities, they prospered beyond anything the world had ever seen. But gradually, the divine nature in the Atlanteans began to fade. They became more human and less godlike. They started to value material possessions more than spiritual qualities. They grew proud of their power and wealth. They began to believe that they were superior to other peoples and had the right to rule over them. They forgot the wisdom of their ancestors and the laws of the gods. The corruption of the Atlanteans showed itself in their increasing aggression toward other nations. They had once been content to rule their own island and trade peacefully with other peoples. But now they wanted to conquer the entire world. They assembled great fleets and armies and began to attack other lands. They conquered much of Europe and Africa, and only Athens stood in their way. The war between Atlantis and Athens was a struggle between two very different civilizations. Athens represented the ideals that Plato admired, a society ruled by wisdom and dedicated to justice. Atlantis represented the corruption that he feared, a society that had abandoned virtue for power and wealth. The conflict was not just military but philosophical, a battle for the soul of civilization itself. According to the story, Athens won this ancient war through courage and virtue. The Athenian army, though greatly outnumbered, defeated the Atlantean forces and freed the conquered peoples. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Just as the war was ending, a great catastrophe struck both civilizations. Earthquakes and floods destroyed the Athenian army and caused the island of Atlantis to sink beneath the sea in a single day and night. The story breaks off abruptly at this point. Plato never finished the dialogue of Kritos, leaving many questions unanswered. Why did he stop writing? Did he lose interest in the story? Did he decide that he had made his philosophical point and did not need to continue? Or did he intend to write more, but was prevented by illness or death? The unfinished nature of the Critias dialogue has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some believe that Plato deliberately left the story incomplete to encourage readers to think for themselves about its meaning. Others suggest that he realized the story was becoming too complex and was distracting from his main philosophical purposes. Still others think that he simply ran out of time before he could complete his ambitious project. Whatever the reason, the story of Atlantis as Plato left it was complete enough to capture the imagination of readers for over 2,000 years. The tale had everything that makes for compelling storytelling: exotic locations, advanced technology, divine ancestry, moral conflict, and ultimate catastrophe. But it also served Plato's serious philosophical purposes by illustrating the dangers of corruption and the importance of maintaining virtue in both individuals and societies. The literary techniques that Plato used in telling the story were sophisticated and deliberate. He embedded the tale within a chain of transmission that gave it an air of authenticity, while also allowing him to distance himself from its literal truth. He provided specific details that made the story seem realistic, while also including elements that suggested symbolic meaning. He used the dialogue form to present different perspectives on the story's significance, while avoiding direct statements about his own intentions. The birth of Atlantis in Plato's dialogues represents one of the most successful marriages of philosophy and storytelling in human history. The tale has entertained countless readers while also provoking serious thought about the nature of civilization, the corruption of power, and the relationship between myth and truth, whether Plato intended it as history or allegory. The story of Atlantis has achieved a kind of immortality that its fictional inhabitants could never attain. The master craftsman carefully examined the wooden chair before him. It was well made, sturdy, and functional, but he knew something that others might not understand. This particular chair was just a copy of something far more perfect. Somewhere beyond the physical world existed the perfect form of chair, an ideal that contained everything that made chairs truly chairs. Every wooden chair was just a poor reflection of that eternal perfection. This idea, strange as it might seem, was central to everything Plato believed about reality, knowledge, and truth. Plato had spent decades developing a revolutionary way of understanding the world. His ideas were so different from common sense that many people found them difficult to accept. But these concepts were the foundation of all his work, including the story of Atlantis. To understand why he might have created that tale and what it was meant to teach, One must first understand the philosophical toolkit that Plato used to make sense of existence itself. The most important tool in this toolkit was Plato's theory of forms. According to this theory, the world we see around us is not the real world at all. Everything we experience through our senses, from chairs and tables to mountains and rivers, is just a shadow or copy of something more real and perfect. The true reality consists of eternal, unchanging forms that exist in a realm beyond space and time. Consider the concept of beauty. When people say a sunset is beautiful, or a song is beautiful, or a person is beautiful, they are recognizing something these different things have in common. But what exactly is this thing called beauty? Plato argued that there must be a perfect form of beauty that all beautiful things share in or copy. This form of beauty never changes and never fades. It is more real than any beautiful object we might see or touch. The same logic applied to abstract concepts like justice, courage, and goodness. These were not just human ideas, but eternal realities that existed whether humans thought about them or not. A just action was just because it participated in the form of justice. A courageous deed was courageous because it reflected the form of courage. The goal of philosophy was to move beyond the changing world of appearances and discover these eternal truths. Plato illustrated this idea with one of the most famous stories in all of philosophy, the allegory of the cave. He asked readers to imagine prisoners chained in an underground cave since birth. They faced a wall and could not turn their heads. Behind them burned a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carried objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners saw only these shadows and mistook them for reality itself. One day a prisoner was freed and turned around. At first the fire hurt his eyes and confused him. The real objects seemed less real than the shadows he had always known. But gradually he began to understand that what he had taken for reality was just a poor copy of something better. Eventually he was dragged outside the cave into the sunlight and saw the real world for the first time. The sun, representing the form of the good, illuminated everything and made true knowledge possible. If this freed prisoner returned to the cave to tell the others what he had discovered, they would not believe him. They might even become angry and try to kill him for disturbing their comfortable illusions. Plato saw this story as a metaphor for the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge and the difficulty of convincing others to make the same journey. This journey from shadows to reality was also reflected in Plato's political philosophy. He believed that most governments were based on ignorance and illusion, like the prisoners staring at shadows on the cave wall. Politicians pursued power and wealth instead of truth and justice. Citizens voted based on their appetites and emotions rather than reason and knowledge. The result was corruption, conflict, and ultimately the destruction of society itself. Plato's solution was radical. He proposed that societies should be ruled by philosopher kings. People who had made the journey from the cave of illusion to the sunlight of truth. These rulers would not want power for its own sake, but would accept the responsibility of leadership because they understood what was truly good for society. They would have studied mathematics, science, and philosophy for decades before being allowed to rule. Most importantly, they would love wisdom more than wealth or fame. The ideal state that Plato described in the Republic was organized according to this principle. Society would be divided into 3 classes, each corresponding to a part of the human soul. The working class would provide for material needs and would be guided by appetite. The guardian class would defend the state and would be motivated by courage and honor. The ruler class would make decisions and would be led by reason and wisdom. This system was designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had destroyed Athens, by putting philosophers in charge and carefully training them from childhood. Society could avoid the cycle of rise and decline that seemed to affect all human civilizations. The philosopher kings would not be tempted by material pleasures because they had learned to value higher things. They would not abuse their power because they understood the true nature of justice. But Plato was realistic enough to know that his ideal state would be extremely difficult to achieve in practice. He recognized that most people were not capable of becoming philosophers, and that even philosophers could be corrupted by power. This is where the concept of the noble lie became important. Sometimes, Plato suggested, it might be necessary to use myths and stories to teach people important truths that they could not understand through pure reasoning. The noble lie was not meant to deceive people for selfish purposes. but to help them live better lives and create more just societies. Just as parents might use fairy tales to teach children about right and wrong, philosophers might use stories to convey moral and political lessons to ordinary citizens. These stories did not have to be literally true as long as they pointed toward deeper truths about human nature and social organization. Plato also developed a method for discovering truth that he had learned from Socrates. This dialectical method involved asking questions and examining the answers to reveal contradictions and hidden assumptions. Instead of simply asserting what was true, the philosopher would engage others in conversation and guide them toward discovering truth for themselves. This process required great skill and patience, but it was the only way to achieve genuine knowledge rather than mere opinion. The dialectical method was like a form of intellectual midwifery. Just as a midwife helped bring new life into the world, the philosopher helped bring new ideas and insights into the minds of others. The philosopher did not give people truth directly, but helped them discover it within themselves. This process was often uncomfortable, because it required people to abandon beliefs they had held for years, but it was necessary for genuine learning to take place. All of these concepts came together in Plato's understanding of education. He believed that learning was not about filling empty minds with information, but about turning the soul toward truth. Most people lived in the darkness of the cave, mistaking shadows for reality. Education was the process of gradually leading them into the light, where they could see things as they really were. This educational process had to begin early and continue throughout life. Children would start with music and gymnastics to train their emotions and bodies. They would then study mathematics to learn about eternal relationships and patterns. Eventually, the most gifted students would study philosophy and learn to contemplate the forms themselves. Only after decades of preparation would they be ready to take on the responsibilities of leadership. When Plato created the story of Atlantis, he was using all of these philosophical tools. The tale functioned as a kind of noble lie that taught important lessons about politics and morality through an engaging narrative. It showed what happened when a society abandoned the pursuit of wisdom and virtue in favor of power and wealth. It illustrated the cycle of corruption that affected all human institutions, unless they were guided by philosophical principles. The story also demonstrated Plato's dialectical method by raising questions rather than providing simple answers. Was Atlantis real or fictional? What caused its destruction? How could societies avoid the same fate? These questions encouraged readers to think more deeply about the nature of civilization and the requirements for justice and stability. The story of Atlantis reflected Plato's belief that there were eternal truths about politics and morality that could be discovered through philosophical inquiry. The rise and fall of civilizations was not random, but followed patterns that could be understood and perhaps avoided. By studying these patterns and learning from the mistakes of the past, it might be possible to create societies that were more just and stable than any that had existed before. The tools that Plato had developed over a lifetime of philosophical work all came together in the creation of Atlantis. The story was simultaneously entertainment and education, myth and philosophy, warning and hope. It showed both the heights that human civilization could reach and the depths to which it could fall. Most importantly, it challenged readers to think for themselves about the most important questions facing any society. What is justice? How should people live together? What causes civilizations to rise and fall? These questions were as relevant in Plato's time as they are today. And the story he created to explore them continues to provoke thought and debate, more than 2,000 years after he first told it. The wise teacher watched his students struggle with a difficult mathematical problem. They had all the knowledge they needed, but somehow they could not see the solution. Then he told them a simple story about a farmer who needed to divide his land among his children. Suddenly, the abstract mathematical concepts became clear through the concrete example. The story had unlocked understanding that pure logic could not achieve. This, the teacher realized, was exactly what Plato had done with his tale of Atlantis. Like a master craftsman, Plato had built layers of meaning into his story that revealed themselves only to careful readers. On the surface, Atlantis appeared to be a thrilling adventure tale about a lost civilization. But underneath lay profound lessons about human nature, political power, and the fate of societies. Every detail of the story had been chosen for a purpose. Every description crafted to illuminate important truths about the world Plato knew. and the dangers he feared. The most obvious meaning of the Atlantis story was its warning about the dangers of hubris. It's a Greek word for excessive pride or arrogance. The Atlanteans had been blessed by the gods with every advantage: fertile land, abundant resources, advanced technology, and wise laws. For many generations, they had used these gifts responsibly and had prospered beyond measure. But success had gradually corrupted them, making them believe they were superior to other peoples and had the right to rule the world. This theme would have resonated powerfully with Plato's readers who had witnessed the rise and fall of Athens within living memory. Like the Atlanteans, the Athenians had once been blessed with natural advantages and divine favor. They had defeated the mighty Persian Empire and had created the most advanced civilization the world had ever seen. But success had made them arrogant and aggressive, leading them to pursue imperial ambitions that ultimately destroyed their democracy and brought ruin upon their city. The parallel between Atlantis and Athens was not accidental. Plato was using the fictional story to comment on real historical events and to warn his contemporaries about the patterns that led to the destruction of great civilizations. The message was clear: no society, no matter how powerful or advanced, was immune to the corrupting effects of power and wealth. Only by maintaining virtue and wisdom could any civilization hope to survive and prosper. But the story worked on a political level as well, serving as an allegory for the different types of government that Plato had observed and analyzed. Atlantis began as something approaching his ideal state, with wise rulers who governed according to divine laws and cared more for virtue than for material gain. The 10 kings met regularly to discuss common affairs and settle disputes peacefully. They hunted sacred bulls and shared ritual meals that reminded them of their divine heritage and moral responsibilities. This idealized Atlantis represented what Plato believed government could be, if it were guided by philosophical principles rather than personal ambition. The rulers were not ordinary politicians seeking power and wealth, but philosopher kings who understood the true nature of justice and the good. They governed according to eternal laws rather than popular whims or personal interests. They made decisions based on wisdom rather than emotion or immediate advantage. But Plato showed how even this ideal system could be corrupted over time. As generations passed, the divine nature in the Atlantean rulers gradually faded and was replaced by human weaknesses. They began to value material possessions more than spiritual qualities. They grew jealous of each other and competitive rather than cooperative. They started to see their subjects as resources to be exploited rather than people to be served. This transformation reflected Plato's observations about the cycle of political change that seemed to affect all human societies. He had seen how democracy in Athens had degenerated into mob rule and eventually collapsed into tyranny. He had watched oligarchies become corrupt and oppressive. He had observed how even well-intentioned reforms could lead to unintended consequences and new forms of injustice. The story of Atlantis captured this universal pattern of political decay. The moral dimension of the story was equally important. Plato used the tale to explore questions about individual character and the relationship between personal virtue and social stability. The corruption of Atlantis did not happen suddenly, but developed gradually as individuals made small compromises with their principles. Each generation was slightly less virtuous than the one before, until the accumulated moral decay reached a tipping point that brought catastrophic collapse. This process mirrored what Plato believed happened in individual souls when people allowed their appetites and emotions to overcome their reason. Just as the ideal state required philosopher kings guided by wisdom, the ideal person required the rational part of the soul to govern the emotional and physical parts. When this natural hierarchy was reversed, both individuals and societies became disordered and ultimately self-destructive. The geographical details that Plato provided for Atlantis also carried symbolic meaning. The island was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, at the very edge of the known world. This placement suggested that Atlantis represented something beyond ordinary human experience, a kind of ideal that was both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. The circular design of the capital city, with alternating rings of land and water, may have symbolized the harmony and order that Plato believed should characterize the ideal state. The advanced technology of the Atlanteans served a similar symbolic function. Their ability to carve harbors from solid rock and create sophisticated canal systems, demonstrated what human beings could achieve when they worked together according to rational principles. But their use of this technology for conquest and oppression showed how even the greatest human achievements could be perverted by moral corruption. The religious elements of the story were particularly significant for understanding Plato's deeper purposes. The Atlanteans were descendants of Poseidon, the god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses. This divine ancestry gave them special powers and responsibilities, but it also meant they were held to higher standards than ordinary mortals. When they abandoned their divine heritage in favor of purely human concerns, they lost the protection of the gods and faced divine punishment. This aspect of the story reflected Plato's belief that human beings had a dual nature, part animal and part divine. The animal part included the physical body and its needs for food, shelter, and reproduction. The divine part included the rational soul and its capacity for wisdom, justice, and beauty. A good life required keeping these two parts in proper balance, with the divine element governing the animal impulses. The destruction of Atlantis by earthquakes and floods represented what happened when this balance was lost. The earth itself rebelled against a civilization that had abandoned its proper relationship with the divine order. This was not arbitrary divine punishment, but the natural consequence of violating the fundamental laws that governed both individual souls and human societies. Plato's use of Egyptian priests as the source of the story added another layer of meaning. Egypt represented ancient wisdom and stability to the Greeks, a civilization that had endured for thousands of years while others rose and fell. By attributing the story to Egyptian sources, Plato was suggesting that the lessons of Atlantis were not just Greek concerns, but universal truths about human nature and social organization that had been recognized by wise people throughout history. The chain of transmission from the Egyptian priests to Solon to Cratias and finally to Plato himself also served an important function. Each link in this chain was associated with wisdom and virtue in Greek culture. Solon was remembered as a great lawgiver who had helped establish Athenian democracy. Cratias, despite his later association with the 30 tyrants, came from a distinguished family with a tradition of public service. This genealogy of wisdom gave the story additional authority while also allowing Plato to distance himself from claims about its literal truth. The educational purpose of the story became clear when one considered how it functioned as a teaching tool. Unlike a philosophical treatise that presented abstract arguments, the tale of Atlantis engaged readers emotionally and imaginatively, created vivid pictures in their minds, and made them care about the fate of the characters. This emotional engagement made the philosophical lessons more memorable and persuasive than purely rational arguments might have been. The story also encouraged active thinking rather than passive acceptance. By presenting the tale as ancient history rather than contemporary allegory, Plato invited readers to draw their own conclusions about its meaning and relevance. They had to work to decode the symbolism and apply the lessons to their own circumstances. This process of interpretation and application was itself a form of philosophical exercise that developed critical thinking skills. Most importantly, the story of Atlantis demonstrated Plato's belief in the power of myth to convey truths that could not be captured in purely rational discourse. Some aspects of human experience, particularly those involving values, emotions, and ultimate meanings, required narrative and metaphor to be fully understood. The destruction of a great civilization was not just a political or military event, but a spiritual catastrophe that could only be adequately expressed through the language of myth and symbol. In creating the story of Atlantis, Plato had achieved something remarkable. He had crafted a tale that worked simultaneously as entertainment, education, and inspiration, satisfied the human need for compelling stories, while also challenging readers to think deeply about the most important questions facing any society. Whether one believed the story was literally true or purely fictional, its power to provoke thought and discussion was undeniable. This was exactly what Plato had intended, a philosophical method disguised as an adventure story, teaching tool that would continue to educate and inspire readers for generations to come. The young scholar in medieval Baghdad carefully copied the ancient Greek text onto fresh parchment. His hands moved slowly and precisely as he translated Plato's words into Arabic. The story of Atlantis had traveled far from its birthplace in ancient Athens. Through the work of translators like this one, the tale would survive the fall of the Roman Empire and inspire new generations of thinkers across different cultures and centuries. The journey of Atlantis through history reveals how powerful ideas can transcend their original context and take on new meanings in different times and places. What began as a philosophical allegory in 4th century Athens became a cultural phenomenon that influenced everything from medieval literature to modern environmental movements. Each generation discovered something new in Plato's ancient tale, adapting it to address their own concerns and challenges. The first person to interpret the story was Aristotle, Plato's most famous student. But Aristotle rejected his teacher's tale as pure fiction. He believed that Plato had invented Atlantis to illustrate philosophical points about ideal societies and their corruption. According to Aristotle, his teacher was the kind of person who could create a civilization and then destroy it just to make a point about politics. This skeptical view would influence many later scholars who saw the story as allegory rather than history. Other ancient writers took a different approach. Plutarch, the famous biographer who lived in the 1st century after Christ, was fascinated by the story and believed it might have some historical basis. He wrote about islands in the Atlantic Ocean and suggested that Plato might have been describing real places that had been forgotten over time. This began a tradition of trying to locate Atlantis in the real world that would continue for centuries. The early Christian writers who encountered Plato's works faced a difficult challenge. They admired his philosophical insights, but struggled with stories that involved pagan gods and ancient civilizations that supposedly existed before the biblical creation. Some tried to reconcile the story with Christian chronology by suggesting that Atlantis had existed after Noah's flood. Others saw the tale as a pagan version of the flood story itself, with the destruction of Atlantis paralleling God's judgment on human wickedness. When the Roman Empire fell and much of Greek learning was lost in Western Europe, the story of Atlantis might have disappeared forever. But Islamic scholars in places like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba preserved and translated Plato's works. Muslim philosophers like Al-Farabi and Averroes studied the story and found in it lessons about the rise and fall of civilizations that seemed relevant to their own expanding Islamic empire. The return of Plato's works to Western Europe during the Renaissance sparked new interest in the Atlantis story. Scholars who had rediscovered classical learning were excited by the possibility that ancient civilizations might have achieved knowledge and technology that had been lost. The story of Atlantis seemed to offer hope that human achievement had no limits, and that the ancients might have secrets that could benefit the modern world. The great explorer Christopher Columbus was influenced by classical texts that described lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. When he sailed west across the Atlantic, he may have been partly inspired by stories like Atlantis that suggested advanced civilizations might exist in unknown parts of the world. After the discovery of America, many writers suggested that the New World might be the location of Plato's lost continent. Sir Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and scientist, used the Atlantis story as inspiration for his utopian work called The New Atlantis. In Bacon's version, explorers discovered a hidden island where scientists had created an ideal society through the systematic study of nature. This scientific utopia reflected Renaissance optimism about the power of human reason and experimentation to improve the world. Thomas More, another English writer, drew on similar themes in his famous work Utopia. Like Plato, More described an ideal society located on a distant island. His fictional civilization had solved many of the problems that plagued 16th century Europe, including poverty, war, and religious conflict. The influence of Atlantis on these utopian writers shows how Plato's original story continued to inspire new visions of human possibility. The age of exploration brought new claims about the location of Atlantis. As European navigators mapped previously unknown parts of the world, they often compared their discoveries to Plato's descriptions. The Canary Islands, the Azores, and various Caribbean islands were all proposed as possible sites of the lost civilization. These theories reflected a growing belief that Plato might have been describing real geographical features rather than pure fiction. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries brought new methods for evaluating historical claims. Scholars began to apply more rigorous standards of evidence to ancient texts. Some concluded that Atlantis was clearly fictional, while others argued that the story might preserve dim memories of actual events like volcanic eruptions or tsunamis that had been transformed by oral tradition over thousands of years. The 19th century saw an explosion of interest in lost civilizations as archaeologists began to uncover evidence of previously unknown cultures. The discovery of Troy by Heinrich Schliemann seemed to prove that some ancient stories dismissed as myths were based on historical reality. This encouraged new speculation about Atlantis and led to the development of what would later be called alternative archaeology. Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and amateur scholar, published a book in 1882 called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World that became enormously influential. Donnelly argued that Atlantis had really existed and that it was the source of civilization in both the Old and New worlds. He claimed that similarities between ancient cultures on different continents could only be explained by their common origin in the lost continent. Though his theories were rejected by mainstream scholars, his book sparked popular fascination with Atlantis that continues today. The 20th century brought new interpretations of the Atlantis story influenced by developments in psychology, anthropology, and environmental science. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, saw Atlantis as an example of what he called archetypal stories that expressed universal human concerns about the rise and fall of civilizations. These stories appeared in many cultures because they addressed fundamental anxieties about human nature and social organization. Environmental scientists found new relevance in the story as concerns about climate change and ecological destruction grew. The tale of a technologically advanced civilization that destroyed itself through environmental abuse seemed to offer warnings about humanity's relationship with nature. Some writers used Atlantis as a metaphor for what might happen to modern industrial civilization. If current trends continued, the New Age spiritual movement that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s embraced Atlantis as more than just a story or historical possibility. New Age teachers claimed that Atlantis had been a spiritually advanced civilization, whose inhabitants possessed psychic powers and mystical knowledge. They suggested that some souls alive today were reincarnated Atlanteans, who carried memories of the lost continent's wisdom. Modern archaeological discoveries continued to fuel speculation about historical bases for the Atlantis story. The excavation of Akrotiri on the Greek island of Santorini revealed a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that had been buried by a massive volcanic eruption around 1500 before Christ. Some scholars suggested that this catastrophe might have inspired Plato's tale, though the timeline and location did not match his specific descriptions. Popular culture embraced Atlantis with enthusiasm throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Hollywood movies, television shows, comic books, and video games all featured versions of the lost continent. These popular adaptations usually emphasized adventure and spectacle rather than philosophical themes, but they helped keep the story alive in public imagination. Academic philosophers continued to study Atlantis as an example of Plato's teaching methods and political theories. They analyzed the story's structure, symbolism, and relationship to other dialogues. Modern Platonic scholarship generally treats Atlantis as a philosophical allegory rather than historical account. But scholars continue to debate exactly what lessons Plato intended to convey. The internet age brought new possibilities for sharing theories about Atlantis and searching for evidence of its existence. Satellite imagery allowed amateur researchers to look for underwater structures that might be remnants of lost civilizations. Online communities shared theories that ranged from serious scholarly hypotheses to wild speculations about alien involvement or advanced ancient technology. The enduring appeal of Atlantis across so many different cultures and time periods reveals something important about human nature. People in every age have struggled with questions about the relationship between technological progress and moral development. They have worried about whether their own civilizations might be vulnerable to the same forces that had destroyed great societies in the past. The story of Atlantis provides a framework for thinking about these universal concerns. Contemporary political thinkers continue to find relevance in Plato's tale. Some see parallels between the corruption of Atlantis and the challenges facing modern democracies. Others use the story to warn about the dangers of imperial overstretch or environmental destruction. The specific applications change with each generation, but the underlying themes remain constant. The remarkable journey of Atlantis from ancient philosophical dialogue to global cultural phenomenon demonstrates the power of great stories to transcend their original context. Whether understood as history, allegory, or pure fiction, Plato's tale continues to provoke thought and discussion more than 2,000 years after he first told it. The ripple effects of his creation have spread far beyond anything he could have imagined, touching every continent and inspiring countless works of art, literature, and speculation. The story's ability to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining its essential power shows why Plato chose narrative over pure argument as his preferred method of philosophical instruction. Ideas presented as abstract theories might be forgotten or become obsolete, but stories that touch fundamental human concerns can remain relevant across vast changes in culture and technology. In creating Atlantis, Plato achieved a kind of immortality that no merely factual account could have provided.